All right, Sally, you should be live.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We have two consultants from BAE, a nationally known company, with us tonight, Mary and Bellal. Mary's given a presentation before at Planning Commission. This is her second presentation. It's a fiscal impact analysis. And during the presentation, she and Bellal will be taking turns. If you have comments, you can put them in the chat. If you're watching from home live, you can email me and I will proctor the discussion and give the questions to Mary and Bellal. And so with that, I'd like to introduce them. Which one is going to start? Mary, are you going to kick it off?
Yes, I will. Yes.
All right, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to come and present our fiscal impact analysis. What we'll be covering, and I guess I should first say that I'm going to start this off and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Bilal Ali. He did much of the analysis and gathered so much of the data on this, so he's going to be able to dive a little deeper into this, and then I'll be back on toward the end. The agenda is we'll be just doing an overview of what a fiscal impact analysis is, so everybody's clear on what we did, and then how we're doing how we did the fiscal impact analysis of the 2020 Annapolis Comprehensive Plan update. We're part of a team. In fact, we have the other consultants, some of the other consultants on this too. So we're part of a team working together with planners and a crew. And then we'll have a discussion of how we did the major assumptions, do a little bit of sensitivity analysis to test out different things, including the impact of COVID. It's one of the things that'll come up. And then supportable non-residential development discussion, and then some key takeaways. And then, as Sally said, we will take some questions if you in the chat or email them into Sally, and we'll work to do our best to respond to those. Okay. So while we're here, we have been, this is actually our second year in working on the comprehensive plan. Last year, we conducted a market analysis, and I presented that to you. I believe that was last fall. And so we completed that part. And over the months and a little bit at that meeting, we were talking about doing some kind of fiscal impact study. And I know a number of the Planning Commission members were interested in that. So that's what we focused on. We had a sort of a debate over how best to do it. But that's where we are now. And just so you know, the fiscal impact analysis is really to test the sustainability of growth that's projected in the plan. Normally it's in the plan in terms of services that are provided by the city government. So it looks at the services that are provided as a cost. That can be police or fire or parks, and then puts that in with the development, and then you figure out fiscal impact of what the development would be, because those services would potentially change. And then what I should say is that typically when you do a fiscal impact analysis as part of a comprehensive plan, it would be conducted later in the planning process, that we would actually have the plan more gelled out. We're kind of doing it in a projection stage at this point. But the good thing about that, I mean, I think we made some pretty good assumptions about what will be in the plan and the associated land uses and zoning that will go along with it. But we've developed all the parameters of the impact analysis. So it's almost like a plug and play. Once we do get the real plan, we'll be able to just change some of the assumptions to match. So you'll be able to use the analysis again later in the process. This study really helps to provide the parameters for that whole aspect of the planning process that's still underway. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Bilal Ali.
Well, thank you, Mary. So yeah, I'm Bilal, and I got the opportunity to dive a little deep into the Annapolis budget. It was really fun and exciting to do. And so we're here ultimately because Annapolis is going to grow. That's why we have a plan. And these are the projections that you see on the screen. They're the projections that the plan is based on. And so these determine the projections for the rest of the assumptions beyond just fiscal as well. But these are the assumptions that we use in our model. These projections come to us from the Baltimore Metropolitan Council, the BMC, and what's important and interesting about their projections is that the household projection is only 563, so they only expect 563 new homes, new households to be in Annapolis by 2040, but they expect 4,300 new residents. And so if you sort of figure out the average persons per household in those new households, you only account for about a third of the growth. And the rest is just Annapolis households getting bigger. And so 2/3 of the growth of some over 3,000 people are going to come anyway, whether or not you have any new households added. But the BMC believes that they're going to be about 563, and that accounts for some units that we know are being constructed currently or permitted to construct in Annapolis, So the diagram on the right kind of demonstrates this concept. So in Annapolis, you have all the people in gray, and then in blue is all of the growth that we're sort of planning for. And most of that growth is made up of existing households. Some of it is coming from the new households, and a very few new workers are coming as well. So we define the service population, just for your information, so that bottom line here, we define that as the number of residents plus half the number of jobs at any given time. And the reason is just to sort of get an order of magnitude of the number of people that the city serves, and that's pretty standard practice. So you can see there's only 82 new jobs projected in Annapolis over the next 20 years. And so there's not a huge impact in terms of the overall service population growth, which is 7.9% over the next 20 years. And so obviously a natural question about whether, when you're faced with growth is how the growth is going to impact the city's operations. And obviously they will, because residents and workers who live here consume services. And so new residents and workers will also consume services. And those new residents and workers will also bring in new revenues, whether through property taxes or income taxes or spending in the economy as well. So we are basically trying to figure out what that balance is, what the new revenues are, what the new costs are. And it's kind of a tricky question if we kind of look back to the diagram, because some of the services and demand for services are going to increase because Annapolis is growing by that blue circle. Everybody's growing, so the public works budget is going to have to grow to account for everybody that's coming here. But not everybody is paying for new revenues, right? So for example, those 563 new households are going to pay new property taxes, and those property taxes in our model end up actually paying for the cost generated by everybody. So it's not a one-for-one. It's not like you kind of pay for the services you get immediately, right? So we kind of have to figure out what that balance is, and that's what the model is. That's what the fiscal impact is intending to show. And so this is really simple formula for what it is. It's simply the new revenues that we're getting from growth from those existing residents and the new residents, or the existing households that are growing rather, and then the new growth. They're paying property taxes and income taxes and fines and fees and permitting costs and all that. And they're generating new costs in the way of police officers and firefighters and maintenance workers and park services and playground equipment and all that stuff. And in some cases, and in a lot of cases, new growth also generates capital costs. So you can imagine how in some places, there are going to be new roads to service new development or something, or you need to build a new school to account for all the new students that you're projecting to grow. And so I've highlighted capital costs in yellow here because we're actually not going to account for capital costs in our model. And that's just because we think that Annapolis has built out the infrastructure that Annapolis has adequate. It might need to be maintained, obviously, more because there'll be more wear and tear with more people, but that's going to be reflected in maintenance costs and staffing costs. And we don't think that there are going to be any capital costs. Annapolis isn't responsible for schools, for example. So we only focus on the revenues and we subtract operating costs to figure out whether or not that equals zero. And so fiscal impact analysis is not figuring out what we're not as concerned with what the dollar value is of that difference. We're just concerned whether or not it's zero and sort of how far from zero it is, because the budget at the end of the day is the best sort of symbol. It's the best representation of how the government operates, but it's not a perfect representation either. You know, the budget tells us, for example, that police is a really integral part of the government and therefore it receives a lot of money in the budget. But you know, the relative value of it is above and beyond the dollar value. So we're not really talking about loss or profit. We're just talking about how services are provided, and sort of the budget. The budget kind of just indicates how much of it is provided. And so if you were to do this simple formula, you would basically get an answer on this scale. So you would either get a zero or somewhere on the, really fiscally negative result or a really fiscally positive result. And typically what you're going to expect to get is something around zero, because if you're at the extremes, you should already know that or you should have an indication that that's going to be the case. So for example, if you were really negatively fiscal, for example, if you were to project a corporate headquarters, locating in Annapolis, and the city government gives them property tax breaks. Well, they're not paying, any property taxes, but they are bringing in workers, and those workers may or may not live in Annapolis, but they'll spend here, and you want to bring a new headquarters here. So that, that development might be a fiscal loser, but in the long run, it's sort of part of your broader economic development strategy. Similarly, like how affordable housing can be a fiscal loser in the sense that a lot of affordable housing they don't pay property taxes, but they're critical to maintaining a certain jobs and housing balance that supports the economy in the city. So, and on the other side, we know that, for example, non-residential developments like commercial retail development is a net fiscal winner almost always, because they're paying property taxes, but they don't bring any residents who demand all the services. Right? Workers only demand half the services, and there are not that many associated with retail. So they're always fiscal winners, but you can't just keep building commercial property because you have to have a market to support it. So if you're on the extremes, there's usually a reason that you already know. And if not, then there's something else going on. Like if you were really red and you were kind of shocked about that, it's because like the services and the government are really inefficient right now. Or if you were really, really positive and you were making a huge profit, you can make the case the taxes are just too high, that they shouldn't be getting that much revenue if they're only providing so much service. So you really shouldn't be at the extremes unless you know you're going to be at the extremes. And so therefore, the goal really is to be just hovering around zero. And typically you're going to be kind of, maybe you're right at zero, you're just slightly above, slightly below, and different scenarios kind of take you in either direction. And there's a lot of interpretations to that, but if you're right around zero, then you're basically saying that the level of growth you have is sustainable. If you're just slightly under zero and you can't quite get to zero, that means that you probably would have to adjust your services a little bit in the long run to accommodate that growth. But there are plenty of reasons to expect that, your fiscal situation could improve. And on the other hand, you might have a little bit of a surplus, but, other costs could rise. And so you end up back at zero again, too. So the idea is really to be marginally fiscal, and that's what we're going to be testing this growth for in the plan. Okay, so how do we calculate fiscal impact? And so along the bottom, I just have a really basic example, and it pretty much explains the text in the box, which we will get to, and we'll work through the Annapolis model. But basically what the concept is, in step one, you would analyze, in step 1 and 2, you're analyzing costs. And so in step 1, you figure out which costs are variable. So which services are going to be impacted by growth. So in this example, the park, we spoke with the Parks Department, and we spoke with every department in the government, in fact. And Park said, well, about half of our costs are going to be variable because we need to increase the number of workers we have, or the number of playground equipment that we provide in our parks to meet the demand from growth. So in this hypothetical example below, let's just say that the parks budget was $40,000 and 20,000 of those costs will be affected by growth. So costs like, the office administration costs won't change no matter how many people, move to Annapolis or whatever the growth level is. So we say $20,000 are variable. And let's say that there were 100 residents in Annapolis, then that means that for every new resident, it would cost $200 to provide the same level of service provided by the $20,000 today. And then in step 2, we would project those unit costs. So we'd say, okay, it costs $200 per resident, and we're expecting 50 new residents, so that's $10,000 by multiplying the two together. And in fact, we do that with all the costs in all the different departments. And the 4 factors that we project across are the household growth rate, the service population growth rate, the residential population growth rate, and the job growth rate, which we had in the first slide, and we'll see again in a minute. And so in step 3, we'll analyze the revenues, and there are 3 components to the revenue: property tax, income tax, and the other taxes. So at the bottom, we have an example of the property tax. So simply, we just figure out, how many new units are going to be built. So let's say in this hypothetical example, it's 10, and they're all valued at $500,000. And the total value of those is $5 million. And we apply the property tax, and we determine that that's $36,900 in additional revenue. So the fiscal impact is literally just $36,900 minus the $10,000. And what's interesting is, or what sort of makes this analysis a little conservative, is that we only project the property taxes for the new developments. So those new households, those 563 new households, we're only assuming that they pay property taxes. We don't assume an increase in the existing property tax base. So that, potentially reduces our fiscal impact because we're not accounting for that. And then using those same development assumptions, so as we'll see, like these 10 new units in this particular simplified example, we'll say, okay, what's the incomes that are required to purchase or rent those units? And then we figure out backwards what the income tax would be from those households, and that determines an income tax total. And then all the other revenues like licenses and permits and things like that, which are relatively small portions of the budget, we just project on a per capita basis. So we say, we'll divide it by the service population and just multiply it by the growth in service population. So in the simplified example along the bottom, let's just assume that we're only projecting parks costs, and the only revenues are the property tax. Your fiscal impact is just the revenues minus the costs. You get $26,900. And so applying this to our model, and we don't have to dwell on this kind of really ugly diagram, it's just a screenshot from the model, but basically this is what we're doing. So here's the police budget. It's $19.6 million. And so for the contractual services budget line, we simply divided it by the number of households, and then we multiplied it by the 20-year change in households to get a total value. And for the rest of the supplies and other line, we did the same thing, and we get a 20-year cost of $84,000. And then we project all of the staff out the same way. So we say all of these staff all these staffers are going to be affected by growth. We're going to need more of them relative to how many there are today. We're just going to project that out by the number of households. The decision to use households for police and fire, by the way, came from the police departments and fire departments. They think that their services tend to correlate with development, like physical development, as opposed to people. So they thought that it would be more appropriate to project using household growth as opposed to anything else. And so that's what we've done here. You'll notice that these bottom 3 positions were held fixed. This is like the police captain, for example, and this is how we would hold cost fixed in other departments too. Like in the office of the mayor, most costs are held fixed because really not much is going to be impacted by growth. So this is just an example of how we do step 1 in the model. And you can just see the police costs, operating costs are just the $84,000 plus the $457,000 here. And then we did that for all the different departments here. So general government is just kind of a agglomeration of all the different sort of city council through planning and zoning. We figured out through the budget and through discussing with everybody on staff, or the various staff representatives anyway, what costs would be variable. And this is what we sort of figured out. So of the $82.9 million that are budgeted for this year, about 53% were held variable in our model. So only 53% were actually projected out and expected to increase. And then we projected those costs like we said we would. So general government, almost all of those all of those costs were projected by the growth in service population, which grew at 7.9%. But only 20.1% of those costs were, or rather, if we go back a slide, it was only 22% were held variable. So it's a relatively small increase in general government. You can see that public works increases by 8%. We did project it by the service population, so it's roughly in line with that. Parks is projected only by residents, since workers don't really consume sort of park services, so to speak. And if you sum up all of those impacts, it's $2.5 million. I've highlighted in yellow here, this is a really major assumption that we're actually going to test in the sensitivity analysis. So as I just mentioned in the last slide, police department, fire department said their costs really track with growth and development. But in our experience, when doing fiscals, public safety costs tend to increase at least the household growth rate, which is 3.4%. And clearly, this is below that. So we think that in our model, we might have underestimated public safety costs. And so we're actually going to adjust for that in sensitivity analysis just to see what would happen if we try to adjust this estimate. I just bring this diagram up again, just to sort of indicate again how this sort of mismatch between how the different projection bases here lead to sort of different overall growths in the different department budgets. And it's just like, total growth is accounting for the growth in public works, but households is accounting for the public safety, for example. But as we'll see in the next slide, when we analyze revenues, all of the property tax revenue is only coming from these units, which are the new units that we're projecting. So as Mary had mentioned in the beginning, we haven't actually finalized the development projections, so these are just preliminary for now. But they're what we think might be some sketch of the final development program, and we can always test the final development program, so the model is plug and play at this point. But basically, we assume 600 new total units, so there's 560 approximate households that we're projecting over the next 20 years, and we assume some vacancy, and that leads us to 600 total units. And so the breakdown is there are going to be 69 single-family detached, 322 townhomes, 100 condos, and 100 multifamily market rate rental units. And these are the assumption of the sort of price and rent for those. You'll notice that for the single-family detached townhome and condo, which are all for sale, we've assumed relatively high sale prices. So these are above the median market value in Annapolis right now in our market study. But we think that because they're new units, that they'll probably be priced a little higher than the rest of the market. So we basically backwards calculate a market value and then apply the property tax rate to that. And you can see that the residential development generates about 95.3% of the assessed value. The non-residential development generates about 5%. We do something similar. So for non-residential, we project that there's going to be 20,000 square feet each of retail and office development that's net new. And then we just account for rent and cap rates, and we sort of figure out, like, if this was one building, that building would be worth $8.5 million. Similarly, $8.2 million for this office building. So it's just a theoretical singular building. And the same for that multifamily, by the way, would be $21 million for a single multifamily building of 109 units. And basically, we get a market value and we calculate the property taxes, and we assume that, and we find that that's 2.6 million. Which, as you might note, is actually higher than the operating cost impact that we projected. So already just these new households right here in green are generating more revenue than the blue is basically generating in costs. So that's kind of an interesting finding. Then we analyze the income tax. I won't dwell too much on this slide because it's a little complicated. There are a lot of numbers, but basically we use the same 600 units, same breakdown, and we just figured out what it would cost or what it would require for someone to purchase that house or rent that house. We make a series of assumptions. And so, like, for example, the single family home that's $700,000, we think it would take an annual income of $120,000 to purchase it. And then we just calculate an income tax on that. That's $302,000, and it's highlighted in yellow because we'll talk about it in the assumptions. But again, this income tax is only coming from those new units. But as we said, 2/3 of the growth is coming from existing Annapolis households, and many of those people very well might be workers in Annapolis that would also pay income taxes. So it's potentially an underestimate. And then this is just a summary of all the revenues, but we've also done the rest where we just projected these out. And they're relatively small, but we just did a sort of per capita average of these to figure out what the future revenues would be. But you can see clearly that 80.2% of the overall impact is from the real property tax, so there's new development. And it more than makes up for the operating costs, and the overall revenues are 3.2 million. And as you can see here, which I skipped ahead to, but the fiscal impact is positive, $776,000 over the next 20 years. And that's good. That's right around zero. It's a really negligible amount. It's not a profit. There's nothing you can really do with that, especially if you think about it over 20 years, but it's right around zero. It means that the growth that we've projected in the plan in terms of increased demand for government services and stuff is more than made up for by the new revenues. And in fact, only a small portion of the growth pays that revenue, and it more than makes up for the costs. But we had a series of assumptions that could sort of, we've talked about that could push this in either direction, and that's what this slide is. So the main thing is we haven't, one of the main things is that we didn't assume any capital costs, and we think we're justified in that. But there are things like maybe new police vehicles and stuff that aren't totally grant funded that we didn't account for, so that could potentially undermine our result a little bit. But then, like I just said, we didn't account for that income tax from existing households, the workers that might come out of that growth. That could push our fiscal result into more positive, impact it more positively. Similarly, we didn't assume any increase in the existing properties or in their values. So that as in the next 20 years, you could assume that most property values are in the assessed value overall. Annapolis property would increase. That's probably a fair assumption, but we didn't account for that. And then the public safety costs, as we said, are a little slow, so we're going to adjust for this in the sensitivity analysis. But because public safety costs grow at a slower rate than the household growth, we think we need to tinker with them and make them a little higher. So that's going to drag our result down. COVID could have a negative impact because it could just slow down the economy. It could slow down the market for non-residential development too. There might just be less demand for commercial space and office space. And that would undermine our property tax revenues. It would just have a general detrimental effect on the economy. So that would obviously have a negative fiscal impact that we kind of account for in the sensitivity analysis, which I'll show you in the next slide. That being said, we also just did a really brief sort of back of the envelope calculation of supportable non-residential development. Like we have a really broad range, and I'll get to that at the last slide, of sort of what we think is potentially feasible based on current spending levels and the number of jobs in Annapolis today for non-residential development. And we think it could potentially be higher than what we've assumed in the model right now. And if we're right that it could maybe be higher, then that would only increase the property tax revenue because there would just be more development. And then the fundamental thing, this is really, really important, right? The plan itself should just on its own really improve the fiscal situation or improve the economy if it delivers on the economic development policies, the operating efficiencies. This one, is focused on resilience. So, this is about really reducing our costs on that front. And then overall increasing property values by making or keeping Annapolis as a desirable place to live. All of those things will have a positive fiscal impact. And that's actually something we can test later on once we have a stronger sense of what the development programs are and how the economic development policies are settled in the plan. We might actually be able to then figure out what that economic impact is, like what the new levels of spending will be, what the new incomes of the jobs that we track to Annapolis are. We can sort of do a dynamic effect and see how will the plan actually benefit our fiscal situation by the efficiencies that it realizes. So we could do that analysis later in an economic impact analysis. So this is the sensitivity analysis that we're talking about. It's a little scary, but it's not as scary as it looks. So the blue line is the operating costs. And basically all we're doing on the horizontal axis is increasing it as a percentage of the public safety costs. So operating costs are made up of all of the costs from the different governments, and we're just toggling the public safety costs to see how that changes the operating costs. And obviously they increase as we increase the public safety costs. Right now, public safety costs are projected to increase 2.65% over the current adopted levels. That's what our model spit out as. And we think that number should at least be 3.43% because that's the household growth rate. So if you see that if the operating cost did increase by that much, we'd still actually be in the green here because we'd be below this purple line, which is the current revenue estimate. And in fact, public safety costs could increase by up to 4.64%, at which point you'd be exactly zero. And this 7.87%, this is the growth in the service population. So we think they would grow by at most up to this level, at which point from here to here, this would be your fiscal gap in the red. And then these two lines, sort of worst case scenarios, where we essentially looked at the effect of the recession on property values in Annapolis. And we sort of found that in the first 3 years, they fell by 19.4%, and then overall they fell by 25.4% before starting to rise again. And so if we just adjust property value revenue by that much, we sort of fall on the revenue line here, and you can see clearly that all of this red becomes a lot bigger. So if any sort of situation on this line, any position on this line is equally likely, then obviously the red is a little bigger than the green, but we're all hovering around zero. There's a probability that we're green, there's a probability that we're red, might be a little higher, but just as we just mentioned in the assumption slide, there were plenty of factors that could kind of push and pull us in either direction. And either way, we're really hovering around zero. And in fact, the worst case scenario is if your revenues are only 2.6 million because property values fell by 25%, and then your public safety costs actually increase, over 5 points from what we estimate, and your operating costs are now like 4.6 million. That's a $2 million fiscal gap that over 20 years is still pretty marginal. So basically, it's a neutral result that you have here. And that's really key. And that's really what we were looking for. We think that the Annapolis government operates pretty efficiently, and the new growth, all of the demand and the pressures that it's going to put on the government, it's going to make up for in the revenues. There's nothing really weird going on because we're not ending up sort of consistently over here, and there's nothing extreme going on either end. And so we're basically just hovering around zero, which is what we wanted. And that basically says that as long as we're playing around with these parameters, the fiscal situation in Annapolis as we've constructed it won't change. They won't have to, hire drastically more staffers. They won't have to or drastically reduce their level of service. They're not going to let equipment deteriorate more than they have to or anything. They won't have to make those adjustments to accommodate growth. And just briefly, we don't want to dwell on this really, but like we said, we might have underestimated the non-residential development. And we didn't show the calculations here. Basically, our very large range suggests that actually retail could be for anywhere from 9,000 square feet to like 67,000. And we're kind of towards the lower end with 20,000, same here as well. So, if the COVID doesn't really undermine the demand for that kind of non-residential development and things are kind of bright and the market sort of is on the up and up in Annapolis, you could support a little more than 40,000 square feet overall, then you're only going to increase your property tax. And actually, you won't bring in as many costs. So it's pretty efficient to try to see how you can maximize non-residential development. This is just a fun chart because it kind of puts retail square footage in perspective. So right now we've estimated 20,000. That's about the size of a 99-cent store. But with that, I will turn it over back to you, Mary.
Yes, some key takeaways here. Bilal has explained for you comprehensive plan is neutral. In the worst case scenario tested, we kind of looked at it sort of the worst impact of COVID, other issues. Revenues unaccounted for in the model suggest a still a pretty fiscally neutral result. And this is a desired result.
Mary, I'm sorry, I need to interrupt you just a second to remind everyone to mute. Bilal, I think you might need to mute yourself. There's just some feedback right now.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Okay. So yes, that's what he has shown you is a desired result. Growth in Annapolis is sustainable in terms of the services and infrastructure that's provided today. And but we would say that improving services, infrastructure, and promoting economic development and making, I would say, keeping Annapolis a desirable place to live. I think it already is a desirable place to live. I live here. Are the main goals of the plan, and a good plan will definitely improve the fiscal situation. And that's, I think, it's our presentation. So we're open to questions.
Oh, okay, great. Well, we have a few questions from Alex Klein. I could try to paraphrase, but I think it would probably be easier if Alex, do you just want to go through your questions that you have?
Sure. So one of the first ones I had, and you can just follow along in the chat too if you want, but I'm curious about the the public works costs, whether they include long-term maintenance of any new streets or sidewalks and sewer and water stuff that's a result of new development. While I agree Annapolis for the most part is built out, you look around at a lot of the things that have been approved lately, and while we're not doing large subdivisions, which would be typical of a suburban area, a lot of the new developments do include some infrastructure, and I just listed a few. Terrapin Station, which is yet to be built on Taylor. It's a cul-de-sac with 7 houses, but it has a couple 100 feet of pavement, sidewalks, sewers, water, all that stuff the developer puts in for free, that then the city is responsible for maintaining in the long term. So while it doesn't cost us anything maybe for 30 years, it is going to cost us something eventually. And, a lot of times that's ignored because, it's in the future and that's somebody else's problem. But if you do a lot of that, you're essentially going to go broke, a little bit at a time. And then when it all needs to be replaced, then you're really going to go broke fast. But so I was just curious if it included that. And then the second question was about the cost of debt service. So while public, I'm always curious about the public works costs, and we've attempted to go to PAYGO, which basically use operational funds, revenue we get every year to pay for sidewalk maintenance and paving and all that kind of stuff. We just can't do it. We can't get there. It's just not sustainable. So we have to borrow money to sustain our paving, our paving process every 20 years to repave all the streets. And I'm curious if you figure in that debt service, because as revenues increase, we're going to continue borrowing up to whatever that limit that was considered safe. I don't know, something like 12% of revenue. But that's going to go up and increase the debt service. So I'm just curious if those kind of things have been factored in.
So for the public works, we didn't, like you said, the developers paid for the sidewalks and things. So we didn't have to incorporate the capital costs of building that stuff. But we did project an increase in public works costs. So here, actually public works costs increased by 8% over the budget by the maximum possible rate that it could have grown by that we've projected. So, the service population grows by 7.9%. That's the fastest sort of growth rate here, being below a residential population, but and that's how much the public works costs grow by. So they do grow, and then essentially that accounts for the new staff and other general fund budgeted equipment that it would require to maintain that infrastructure. So it is there.
It's not really staff per se. It is. So this is where this weird thing you get is like, how do you bookkeep stuff? Is it, is that a capital cost or is that an operational cost? And because it's not just salaries and stuff like that, but that kind of maintenance, you have to go out and buy stuff to replace, the sidewalks and all that stuff as it breaks.
Right. Well, yeah. And with some of the equipment, so like trucks and things like that, we actually did an inventory of, and most of them are in good shape. Most of them, the replacement life for a lot of them is pretty long. It's like some of the cement mixers and things like that. But you're right. I mean, there are some capital costs that aren't just infrastructure that are certain heavier drill duty equipment, maybe cement, things like that we didn't account for here because we didn't have a reliable inventory or a way to sort of project those costs. And that is a caveat, yes.
Right, because we don't generally do a lot of that stuff ourselves. It's generally contracted, especially stuff like paving. So the fact that the city doesn't own any paving trucks kind of obscures the fact that we're paving a lot of streets every year, and that costs us money. Anyway, it's just the point I'm trying to make here is that kind of ongoing maintenance can be very expensive and shouldn't be discounted, even though, so you have to take into account somehow in your model that to find the right proxy to deal with that.
Yeah, well, in the report, we did include a brief estimate and sort of, we didn't want to incorporate it into the fiscal analysis because some of the projections and estimates were a little tenuous and they didn't totally match up with the factors we have here. But we did come up with a sort of rough estimate of what those capital costs might be. And that includes looking at the inventory of this kind of equipment that you're talking about within Public Works. And we were provided that inventory by the city. I can pull up the report and try to find that number for you. Or when the report's published, it'll be in there, but there is an estimate of capital costs, and it is rough. It is a few million, including, new vehicles and equipment for police as well. So, because not all of those are paid for by general fund monies, which is what this is focused on. This is the adopted budget only reflects the general fund. So, like to your question about debt service, that's a different fund. And finance, yes, it is a cost, but the Department of Finance tends to have a sense of the cash flow analysis for that, and it's not necessarily growth related. Based on our discussions with the departments, no one needed to increase their service by buying capital equipment that required new debt. There might be capital level infrastructure and investments that need to be made, and like I said, I can pull up the table that provides an estimate of that, but we didn't project any capital projects in the way of new infrastructure, new sewer lines, new roads that the city would be responsible for and would have to pay with and debt and bond or whatever. So we didn't account for that. That is true.
And this is Diane Butler. I would also add that in some of the cases where we're adding new roads for new developments, like for instance, South Annapolis Yachting Center, the city's actually paying for the new infrastructure from what I understand. So it's not even like the developers necessarily agree to pay for all the upfront costs, and we don't have any impact fees. So I sort of echo what Alex is saying about the importance of trying to include those costs and the long-term maintenance of that additional infrastructure into this analysis if possible.
Yeah, we can, we can definitely beef up the analysis of the capital costs that we have in the table in the report. And it's just an estimate of a select inventory of some capital costs and equipment, not the streets project. And, for this particular project that you're referencing, we'd have to kind of determine the growth related aspect would just be, the portion of the use that's sort of coming from growth, how many of the new people that come to Annapolis are using that road, and that would be sort of the growth aspect of that cost. But again, in our discussion with Public Works, they didn't think that they needed to necessarily build new infrastructure to support the growth that in the numbers that we showed them. And I guess, and to the extent that they are obviously aware of some of these projects, I would think that they have both the capacity or can sort of continue to grow at the rate that they do. Which is this rate, this sort of 8%, over 20 years, that will bring enough money to support the maintenance, whether it's through staffing or the other sort of general fund services that they provide. But if that's something to reconsider, we can potentially do that.
I think I'm not sure you said at the beginning about how you collected your interviews or your information through interviewing every department director in a series of very long days for you. And what other information did you get from each department?
So typically, so the main thing, I'm just going through these departments that are on the screen now. So police and fire, we got some data on like calls for service from them. We did get an inventory of vehicles, but we actually got that from the fleet manager of the city as well. A lot of those, by the way, are just paid from like either federal or state grants. There's a lot of sort of discounts and stuff on some of that, some of those capital equipment. And they also said that unlike some other police departments, it's not like every officer is going to get a brand new car here because, again, it is a small city. The fleet is mostly in good condition, even if some of the cars are a little older. But we do have that information, and we did convert that into a baseline estimate of capital costs, and that's in the report. And we can present that in some other way as well.
Yeah, I thought it was good that you took into account transfer costs or transfer payments between governments and did some sensitivity on that, or variability on that, because as long as as long as your sugar daddy keeps funneling you grant money, it's all good. But that's not always a given.
True. I mean, in public safety in particular, though, there's an argument to be made that they might face some potential changes in the way they run. That some of their equipment costs might decrease. The nature of their responsibilities might shift and be dispersed throughout different departments in the government as well. It's definitely something to consider with public safety, I think, in the current climate.
I have a question about transportation. I didn't see any numbers on transportation, and we were just in a conversation with the director and the folks over there, and they are trying to turn their fleet into more fuel efficient vehicles, and they project that there are going to be increases in the service there, but I just didn't see it listed as a department.
Yeah, so they're not fully funded by the revenues that they make directly, but they are mostly, and their fund is not. They don't get any general fund monies, and this is focused on the general fund. So their budget is a little independent. We did actually speak with the transportation director as well. We went through their fleet. We went through their capital assets plan over the next 5 years. And yes, the city will be responsible for some costs, and that was an analysis that we did, but it doesn't really jive with the rest of our analysis in that this is all, like, this 82 million is exactly the general fund. And so to add another department where the growth costs are a little tenuous, again, because they do receive a profit for the services they provide, and there's a different, you would have to do a more in-depth analysis, I think, to more accurately capture their fiscal story because of their profits, the profits that they make.
But they're not profitable at all. So I would argue that maybe because they're not profitable, they operate at such a loss that we really do need to sort of look at that.
I think you're definitely right. I think one thing, like when we did speak with them and the data that we did get, and what we did was we kind of fiscally scored their capital needs based on their 5-year plan, which was only completed last year. So it's pretty new. But one reason that we didn't really report it, I don't even think we included it in the report, is the analysis was pretty rough. We did a really good, we've dived into some pretty deep details here, but I think it would have taken a lot more resources and thinking and more specific sort of transportation finance thinking to really dig deeper on that. And that's something that's definitely probably something to explore, but I personally think it was a little beyond the scope of this fiscal, and I don't think we really had the resources to do the due diligence for that analysis for them, because they do have a slightly different fund structure. But it is definitely not accounted for, and it's definitely important to do since they are operating a loss, that's for sure.
How much of their budget comes from the federal grants they receive?
For them, I think it's like 70 or 75%. They get a lot, and they get a lot from the state too. The city was not actually responsible for most. Most was, I think 75 to 80% was the feds in the state.
And one of the problems,
it all comes from the state, through FTA, but it comes from the state.
And what's so interesting about that is that a lot of the new electric vehicles aren't coming in terms of grant money. So if we are trying to convert, as we've said since our 2009 comprehensive plan, our fleets into more fuel efficient and hybrid or electric vehicles, we're going to have to start paying more and not relying on the federal government and state, like Alex said, to pay for these vehicles, unless we want to change our policy and say we're going to just continue to replace fossil fuel vehicles with fossil fuel vehicles, which especially this administration has said they don't want to do. So I think we can't rely on the 75 to 80% funding from state anymore if we're going to really follow our own policies that we're putting in documents like this. Just a comment. And then I just have a question. Do you know how you handled public housing and assisted, or I should say subsidized housing in this analysis?
Yeah, so our population and household projection is from the BMC, right? So we kind of retrofit the types of housing and all that onto their projection. So we assume that their residential and household projection includes people and affordable housing units and residents of those units. And so that's included here. But affordable housing and however many units you project in the plan, which I think there is a number, they don't pay property taxes. So we didn't assume that there. They might generate income tax, but we didn't have an estimate of how many people would be there and what the income restrictions would be. So we didn't calculate that sort of additional revenue, but it would be additional revenue. But they wouldn't pay those property taxes, so that doesn't show up in the revenue anyway. But to the extent that they are part of the cost projections, they are, because they would be technically part of that overall growth.
And I don't know, maybe Sally might know this. Sally, or Mary, are our 790 affordable housing units considered in the BMC analysis?
Do you mean the our public housing, the hacker properties?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
We have some questions on YouTube. Lily Openshaw says, is capital outlay not factored into any department calculations?
Most departments, and I'd have to go through the budget, don't have a capital outlay anymore. I think they are all part of the CIP. I think most department budget line items have erased that capital outlay for FY20. I think there might have been some departments that had it, and if they'd had it and it was determined to be a variable cost, we projected it. But actually, I think one peculiar thing I did notice about the budget was that the general fund didn't actually have a capital outlay for most departments, but I had to double check the budget for that.
Really, our departments never had one until actually this year we added one because we were buying office furniture, but we've never had one in the last 10 years. So I don't know why.
Yeah.
And then Lily asks, developers don't necessarily fund all infrastructure improvements necessary for new development. That's true. They fund their contribution.
Right.
Their impact's worth as determined by adequate public facilities. But if a development doesn't trigger adequate public facilities, they won't be paying for that portion of their impact.
Yeah, and it should be noted, really, I mean, what we're doing is a fiscal impact analysis of the comprehensive plan, right? So it's really broad strokes, it's broad averages, and fiscals are done of comprehensive plans, but I think, especially when you're using it as a tool to say yes or no to development, it's at the project level. And at that level, you would calculate the fiscal impact of the capital cost that specifically the city is responsible for and all that. But I mean, at this point, the development program is just a sketch. So we don't even have an idea of what those projects are, where they would be, or what those demand would be. We're doing a really sort of high level analysis. And as you approve the plan and projects start to come in and ideas start to come in, you would again, pay for a cheaper study of the fiscal impact of just that project, but and that's how you would sort of determine some of those impacts and whether that project itself passes that fiscal test.
That's true. We're trying to build in to the idea that, sorry, that was bad. Of this plan having some iterative properties, so we can come back and check that we're following the plan and its predictions were what we were expecting. So do you have anything you would look for milestones along in the next 2 years, in the next 4 years, in the next 6 years of things that we would want to see so we can check and make sure we're sort of on track to where we thought we were going to be?
Yeah, you'd probably have to just check the development projections first and foremost. I mean, just are the amount of people that we think are going to be here every year here? Are the new households coming at the rate and timing that we think they're going to be built, and people are people moving in? I want to watch the vacancy rates and things like that. But yeah, again, to the extent that the fiscal impact is not really a projection of finances, it's just sort of an estimate of the balance of services and the revenues brought in. You're not really going to be looking at the budget. You would just really be looking at whether or not that growth is coming, and then doing the economic analysis of new businesses, what jobs are they bringing, what incomes are they bringing, and how dynamically, what kind of increases in spending there are in the private sector and things like that. That requires a different study, but that's a useful study to test some of that stuff.
Okay. I have another YouTube question from Anastasia Hopkinson. Have you included estimates of capital costs of new roads, traffic signals, and other transportation related costs of increased population? And then she follows that up by asking if the model deals with necessary improvements at the Chinkopin, Forest Drive, and Aris T. Allen intersection. Estimates vary from 1.5 million to 10 million plus. So I guess if we have some big road construction project coming up in the future that we know about, how would you look at that?
Like if there was a new project, you test it on a project by project basis. But yeah, this in talking with Public Works, they didn't really tell us that they were expecting that growth itself was going to lead to new stuff that just serves growth. It's not like we need a brand new road connecting two different parts of Annapolis to actually move people at an adequate, level of traffic or whatever. And that's the kind of capital cost that we didn't incorporate. Now, maintenance of existing things or the repaving or reconstruction of infrastructure. Is that growth related? Is that just maintenance? We were sort of saying that's maintenance, but on any given project, you could just test the fiscal impact of any given project separately. But yeah, they're not thinking that growth is just going to demand brand new things, no new pipes, no new roads, no new bridges. They don't need to get bigger to accommodate the growth. Yeah. And actually, it's worth pointing out that I don't know if I pointed this out when we did the presentation, but 2/3 of the growth is coming anyway. So to me, you have to figure out, the revenue question is arguably more important. What kind of development can balance the growth that's coming anyway, which is some 3,000 people plus of just Annapolitans making more Annapolitans. And so that growth is coming, and that's not necessarily tied with any specific stream of revenue. And so it's important to note that the revenue is coming just from new development. And so it's not really, growth is not something you can really control. And the development, in fact, is the thing that's the saving grace of this growth in this particular case. Just want to point that out.
But I'll have to qualify that, because it really depends on, and I don't mean to be argumentative here, but it really depends on what are the costs associated with that development. So if it's purely infill development where you've got a bunch of infrastructure already in the ground and you're just replacing a parking lot with a building that all of a sudden now is going to produce a lot more tax revenue, that's one thing. It's another thing if you've got an area where now you're going to have another 400 feet of street that you got to maintain and all the sewer and water infrastructure underneath it, and that infrastructure services only some number of houses. So the cul-de-sac is the perfect example of that, because nobody else is going to ever use a cul-de-sac except the number of houses on it. So that's a case that you can make where you can do a really simple calculation of the tax revenue that's generated from the houses on that cul-de-sac, pay for the long-term maintenance of that. So it really depends.
And you're absolutely right. I was sort of preface what I said, it's only in the way that we've constructed it, which is really high level, right? You're right that any given development, if it's not just infill or redevelopment of an existing site, that has all the appropriate infrastructure. But because we're a little earlier in the process, we haven't even figured out exactly what the development types are let alone where they'll be and where the potential projects would be. Public Works wasn't able to determine what some of those costs are, and that's why we didn't incorporate them, not because they won't exist or because we're ignoring them, but because we can't reliably or reasonably project them yet. And just with the stage that we're at and the data that we have at this current time, this is the best that we can model. And so, yeah, I mean, not accounting for those very important things, yeah, the development is subsidized. Like that development also, yeah, I mean, it could definitely drive up the capital cost that we haven't incorporated, but it's definitely the source of all the revenue, and that's critical.
I'd like to ask a couple of questions, mostly because I don't understand a lot of what went on. But I want to go back. There are two things I want to talk about from the very early, your assumptions about growth. So just so I grasp where you're coming from on that. And then the second question has to do with being able to analyze specific projects and what can be done in those kinds of analyses. So let's talk about the growth. You say that there are 560 some odd units, new units, which are projected over 20 years.
Households, so occupied housing units with families.
So, same thing. Household or a housing unit is the same thing.
Well, a housing unit could be vacant or not. Household is an occupied housing unit. All right. So it doesn't, yeah, it's semantics.
Let's assume that things are going to be occupied, but it's 563 over 20 years.
Yeah.
And where does this come from? What did you call it? The DNC?
No, the BMC, Baltimore Metropolitan, yeah. So.
Oh, okay, that assumption. I mean, I'm just going to toss out, we have a number of units. How many units already projected for Crystal Springs? There are potential number of units in Watergate, potential number of units added to Eastport Terrace Harbor House, potential number of, and those are just three large ones. And we're not even talking what potentially may happen in Hillsmere on the giant property there. I'm finding that a low assumption. I'm concerned about that. And then, and I'm tossing that out. I mean, if you have a response.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I was just going to say, I mean, it might be a little low, but that some of the new construction, so those construction units in the pipeline that you just referenced, you've worked with Chris Jakubiak, who's the planner on the project, with some of this information with the permitting and stuff. So we found that actually those units mostly correspond with this household projection. What's coming in the pipeline and the timing of those kind of corresponds with this projection and the timeline of this 563, and the numbers roughly equal. And so we actually adjusted this 563 accounts for those in the pipeline, along with it's just like the trend is from the BMC, that's the rate of growth, but the number actually does reflect those construction units in the pipeline or permitted to potentially be built.
Okay, all right, okay, I can understand that. I can see where that number comes from. 2/3 of the growth is coming from household growth, the size of each of households, the number of people living in a household. Is that where 2/3 of the growth is coming from?
Yes, yeah, families getting bigger.
Families getting bigger. If you drill down into that, can you give us any more kind of reflection as to where that's occurring? What kinds of households?
They didn't tell us. That's not really in the numbers. The numbers, they look at trends, they do demographic analysis of their own kind, and they basically just publish the numbers. And the numbers, you can see really this person's per household at 2.45 over the next 20 years becomes 2.63 persons per household. And that's a 7.1% increase over 20 years. So it's not like a really drastic increase. It's just that, there were a lot of people in Annapolis already, or a lot of households, or, and so they generate that many people. If you increase it by 0.17 per every house, that's what that equals.
So it's more people, more children coming home. It's more cousins staying in the household. It's more things like that.
Yeah, but we don't know specifically. All we can say is that households are getting bigger, and there are a million reasons that, I guess not a million, but a few reasons that a household gets bigger.
I found that number to be small.
All right.
Too small.
Okay. And jobs, when you talk about jobs, are those jobs in the city or people who are employed at someplace?
No, they're jobs in the city, workers employed in the city of Annapolis.
Help me. Do we get any kind of income tax slice out of people who work in the city but live elsewhere?
No.
Okay. So that figure, that whole line is like, so what? I mean, we already know that lots of people come into Annapolis to work and lots of people leave to work.
Yeah, and yeah, what it's saying is actually not that many more people are going to be working here. It's only included because, so that service population, the definition of that is residents plus half of the people that work here. Because, some government services do serve people who work here. They use the toilet, they drive on the roads, whatever. And so we account for that effect. And it just, it's so small, it only accounts for like 40 people because only half of these people are accounted for in this 4,300 gross. Only 40 of those people are these jobs. So it's really, it's very negligible, but
Okay.
just for we can.
All right. And now I understand what service population means. If I could shift a little bit, when you talked about analyzing specific projects for their fiscal impact, what kinds of things go into that? What sorts of things? If we contracted to require some developer applicant to do a fiscal impact, would it be basically what we're seeing here?
Yeah, but it would be a lot more specific. So a lot of these concerns that have been brought up by Alex and Diana, so about like the capital costs, those you would really have to drill down in that fiscal impact. What are the specific infrastructure requirements based on this given site, and how much are you paying in property taxes, accounting for any deals you're getting from the government to build or whatever. So some of those specific details about the development would be incorporated at that point. And at that point, you'd also have a much better idea of exactly how many units are coming in that project. And at that point, you could have a much more fine-tuned population projection. Like if they're all apartments, then that's going to have a different yield of population than single-family homes, which tend to have more people in them. So that unit mix and all that, you get a lot more specific details that you can actually make more specific actual financial fiscal projections from.
Okay, that's very helpful to help me think it out a little bit. What concerns me in that, and this is a little tangential at the moment, but what concerns me is that there are all sorts of costs that are not directly associated, within 50 yards of a, of a new building. There are effects downstream. There's parks and recreation costs. How do we truly, how do we truly get those costs? How do we get our hands around what those costs are? And how do we truly get our hands around what the transportation, I don't mean bus service, but I mean the transportation infrastructure costs. How do we gauge the true impact of a new development?
Well, so for parks, you would definitely get that in the fiscal, because one thing you'd be doing is you'd be modeling the park's costs. So you'd be saying, okay, what is it, how many people do you employ? How many programs do you have, and what do they cost to run? And how many parks do you have, and what are the costs to maintain all the equipment and all that? And that's all included in the fiscal analysis. So you do include the cost to different parts of the government in a fiscal, even at the project level. But in terms of like transportation impacts, like if you have a specific site and how many people there are in there, and if it's mixed use, how many workers there are, you can make assumptions about like trip rates that are pretty standard. The average trip per person in an apartment versus an average trip per person in a single family detached. And, the Department of Transportation in Annapolis will track how many trips currently occur on the roads. That's one of the metrics they measure road health by. And we can project the increase in trips and the increased wear and tear that might require. Those are components that, based on the project, and if you talk to the department, they're like, you know what, we're concerned that actually there might be too much wear and tear above and beyond what we're used to from this project, but can you test the trip rates and things like that? And we would be able to do that.
I think there's some weaknesses in that that have come out in this discussion. One of them is you're looking really only at operational costs and not really at capital expenditures that might be required. Parks is a good example. Okay, 200 new people in a building. Okay, that requires, half of a job in the Parks Department. But what you're really missing out is, well, where's the new park to service the new people? And that's a capital cost and not an operational cost. You follow me? And it's how to get our hands around not just what I think. Okay, it looks like you have an answer.
Yeah, I'm sorry. No, please. Yeah, well, I mean, I was just going to say, those capital costs are accounted for. It's just like if we need to. I mean, parks specifically, we spoke with the director of parks, Archie, and he said, that we wouldn't build new parks. If anything, there might be new street end parks, which are like $1,000 or so each. And actually, we did an analysis of that, but it just didn't. We weren't sure how it would be paid for, and it was only like a few $1,000s because a street end park doesn't really cost that much to build. So the parks are kind of built out. And again, those capital costs, we didn't account for it in this model because it's too soon to reliably estimate capital costs. But again, at that project level, you would be able to know how many more roads you would need, how much more parkland, if the case may be, you would need, and how many more equipment, playground things you'd have to build onto those parks. You could estimate those once you have clearer details about the project. It's just that at this current level, we're talking about growth in a really broad term. It's not geographically centered. So it's not fair to really calculate capital costs because there's no basis from which to project them. But at the project level, later on, when you have a given development, you can do that a lot more accurately.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Very good, very helpful. Wow.
All right, I had a question or two. First, can you hear me fine?
Yeah.
Hello?
Yep.
All right, this is Ben Sale on the Planning Commission. What's our access going to be to you for questions after this meeting over the next couple of weeks?
I guess
Just route them through me or Eric Lashinsky, and we will figure out a way to get your answers to you.
Okay. All right. I guess everybody take note of that. Send all for future questions to Sally. On another note, how do we look versus other cities of the same size or on a per capita basis for what we're spending on that budget for police, fire, and general government versus other maybe more efficient cities out there or not so efficient? Where do we rank? How do we look?
Personally, I'm not so sure. I mean, I would say that your budget reflects that, police and fire get the largest chunks of the budget, and then public works, and that's pretty consistent across most budgets. I did analysis in Hartford County a while ago that's not too different there. I personally don't have a ton of experience with sort of comparing across, and that's an interesting question and definitely something that'd be really interesting to dive into, but you'd have to think a little bit about what are those comparable cities. Do you have any off the top of your head that you're thinking of, or?
No, if you don't have them off the top of your head, then I don't either. So let's just move on from that. So if there's no good basis for reference at the moment, that's fine. Seeing that police and fire are 20 million a piece roughly, and general government's 30 million. I've always found and heard in past meetings that, what we spend on police and fire just seems to be so much out of our budget with what you'd want to be seeing spent. And then only 6 million plus or minus for parks and rec, when that's the one thing that's really biting us in the butt right now is not having available space for people. And the COVID-19 new world model is people want to stay home and be around in their own neighborhoods. And I believe capital projects for actually purchasing a property or any new properties for parks was not included in this. I think Bob Waldman just hit on that with you. You're just talking about operating budgets. So that one was kind of been answered, but we'll move right on to, you're looking at this whole thing from a doing what we're doing and being able to sustain what we're doing with the current funds that we have. Now, the general opinion of a lot of people is what we're doing right now is good enough. It's not great enough, but What you're saying is we're going to be neutral financially, fiscally, and able to do it in the worst case scenario or the best case scenario. It's still neutral to do what we're doing. Now, let's assume we're going to still do the same thing that we're doing, regardless if it's the great thing that we want or not. I find it hard to digest of even in the worst case scenario, we're still neutral. How does that, what's the big thing that offsets a lack of funds coming in while property values may decline in a worst case scenario? How does that become?
Yeah, I mean, it's new. It's not, yeah, like $2 million gap over 20 years. It's not totally negligible. It means that you'd have to, it's some staffers here and there. It's the speed of service in certain places overall that over 20 years, that's what that would represent. And yeah, it would require maybe a little bit of tightening in that worst case scenario, but not so much that you're like, man, where does this money come from? It's around the edges. It's marginal. And to your point about the size of these, different budgets, I mean, or even just whether the levels of service are appropriate. I mean, we're just taking a snapshot of time, but there are plenty of ways that you can make, the service better by even making it more efficient, more cost effective, and you can still make it better. And whether that's through technological advances or more efficient land use or whatever the case may be. So there are efficiencies, and I think one of the goals of the plan through its many different facets and chapters is to realize some of those efficiencies. And I mean, resilience in particular is to reduce.
All of those things you just said, is that why we're going to be neutral, whether worst case scenario or not?
Well, we're neutral because even in the worst case scenario, it's not that many dollars. It's like $2 million. So it's like marginal. It's not like, oh, well, we need to just like fire 20 police officers tomorrow to make up for this.
$2 million just seems to be very small based on what happened to us back in 2008, 2009. But I'm not the pro, you are, so I'll take that as the word. All right, let's move on to household size. What did you say the average household size increase was going to be per unit, roughly? It was
over the 20 years, every unit's going to be bigger by 0.17 people, approximately.
0.17 people. I mean, I got to be honest with you. I have a lot of friends around here, and I've seen over the last 15 years, it seems like household size is increasing a lot more than that. And if we go into an economic recession, 0.17, I find that hard to swallow. I really do. But if it's, let's say if it ends up being something double that, like 0.5, how much of an effect does that have on us maintaining a neutral outcome?
I mean, definitely has a huge effect, right? I mean, it seems small, but it's, in the aggregate, it's actually a lot. It's a 7.1 increase, a percentage in your size. If your family grew by 7%, you would notice. And that's kind of what that was saying. And so that's why it's not as small as it seems. But yeah, I mean, if that becomes a lot bigger, yeah, it would definitely make it a lot worse and exponentially so, right? Because those existing households would make even more people.
Right.
And so, yeah, it would be, but I think we'd have to pull up the market analysis, which, this has already been reported on and presented. But I think one of the reasons is just like the age breakdown too. Like, yeah, sure, there are people that are having kids and in that age cohort, but how many people that are moving to Annapolis are also older or empty nesters or people that are retiring?
Let's put it out there. Immigration. My children go to a school that is now up to over 60% Hispanic. Love them, great people, but a lot of people living in one household, whether Hispanic or not, a lot more so than we've seen in the past or 20 years ago. And talking to educators, that is the case. They have the data showing all these people living in one household. So households are increasing to me a lot more than 0.17, but that's what I see. You've got data. We'll go from there. But in that respect, though, if
I would say, I mean, if you're interested, and you should read the Baltimore Metropolitan Council's Round 9 projections, because they will really detail what demographic analysis they did to come up with these numbers, and they're more geographically centered. They're the ones who actually investigate, the trends in families and people and all that. And that's not something their methodology should be online. Should be on just their website, Baltimore Metropolitan Council Round 9. They'll publish their methodologies with their projections, and those assumptions are made at that point.
Since that plays such a large role in what we have here for our report, maybe we should get that and post it on our own website along with this as amplifying information. So we should, that's
Right,
something for us
so how the BMC works is that, you know, that monthly spreadsheet that I send out, we take that, we plug it into our model, and to calculate population growth based on a pipeline development. So whenever a project is approved, we put it into the model. The BMC's numbers get updated about every year or so, but they're ultimately based on the census, and they look at our data, they look at past trends, and to predict future trends. And we know in Annapolis, we have a lot of growth of single occupant households in an older demographic, but where we're seeing a lot of growth is in the younger demographic. The under 18 demographic is growing pretty quickly in the city.
Okay, and last question, going back to public housing. Public housing, we don't get property tax for the city from it. We also don't get any, you also mentioned income taxes for individuals. I don't believe the city gets funding for people's income taxes. Am I wrong on that?
Well, if you live in Annapolis, you have to pay your income taxes. So, I mean, the state collects it and disperses it to Annapolis, but it's based on how many people are here. So if you're making an income and you're an Annapolis resident, you're probably paying taxes on it.
So the state's given us the income tax. Right.
Yeah, the state collects all the income tax, but they disperse it relative to how many people paid it within each jurisdiction.
All right, and one last thing, is there any grants factored in or assumed grants over the next 20 years that we might get from the federal government with regards to public housing to help us offset costs? Is that anywhere in this report, or?
No, it's not really a fiscal. It doesn't really affect the fiscal analysis, so it's not really that's not analyzed here. I mean, it does. I mean, in that there are potential revenues, but again, you'd have to have a sense of what the project is and what monies it's eligible for and not, and you do a much more specific technical, pro forma analysis on a given property to figure out that balance of what funds are coming in and not,
Okay.
So, yeah.
Well, thank you very much for that. That's the last question I had. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
Thanks a lot. But like all economists, you talk really fast.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I was, I couldn't even see my own face, and I'm just, I'm listening to my own echo. If I was in front of you, I bet I'd talk a lot more calmly and sort of, colloquially or whatever. So just generally casually. So it'd be a lot
I think
more.
it was very good. I'm just teasing you a little bit. I think it was very good. Thanks.
Sometimes I do have to read his reports twice to make sure I understand them, but he's always happy to explain everything to me. So I don't see any more questions in the YouTube or in the chat. Is there any other last thoughts from our Zoom audience?
Yeah, I have one last question, sort of as to where we're going to go from here. I'm curious if in a follow-up version of this report or some more work you guys are going to do as part of the comprehensive plan, as to whether you'll get into the cost of certain kinds of housing topologies and how those may affect these sort of cost projections. I know that's something that we talked about early on in the process, and so I'm just curious if you're going to look at specific things like, okay, a cul-de-sac versus a purely infill development versus some other kinds of things to help us think about these associated costs, looking at the kinds of developments that may happen, and looking at the associated costs, saying, this is going to be good for us, this is not going to be good for us. And, rather than it being, hand waving by one of us, it would be nice to have some analysis to point to be able to help guide us.
We can do that potentially if that's something that the city decides they want us to do. we're capable of it.
Right. So we still have a lot. I feel like we've been doing this comprehensive plan forever, but we still have a lot of work to do. And our next steps is we're focusing on West Annapolis. As you know, we have a meeting August 11th that I'll be sending out some information. We're going to start looking at visual preference surveys to define those typologies. And actually, Eric Lashinsky promised me he's just going to finish it up pretty soon. So he's just going to take over, do it all. So next week. So no, just kidding. It's still a long time coming, and we're still figuring out how we're the best way to proceed with getting public input, because we can't use our usual method, which is getting everyone together in a big room. So we're still adapting to that. And so our 2020 plan's looking more like 2021 plan. But once we have more information about the typologies, what people want to see in specific locations, then we can ask Mary and Bilal to be a little more specific and fine tune some of their analysis for the specific recommendations that will end up being in the comprehensive plan.
Sally, I have a quick question. I know the West Annapolis visual preference thing will be taking place in August. Is there a timeline for when this will happen in Eastport as well?
Well, West Annapolis is our guinea pig, so we're going to see how that goes with Zoom, working on Zoom. But there will be a survey we will send out to the whole city to talk about different parts of the city and visual preference. And so it won't, that part of gathering input won't be so specific. But once we see how it goes in West Annapolis with this meeting in August, and how it works, getting feedback, we'll start thinking about looking at other parts of the city.
Okay, thanks.
Wow, okay.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
Okay, I want to thank Mary and Bilal so much for all your hard work, your willingness to edit and revise your reports and explain everything to us. And we really appreciate all the hard work that you've put into the work that you've done so far.
Thank
Great.
you.
Yeah, look forward to it.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. And any follow-up questions, feel free to email me if anything occurs to you, or any other questions. You know where to find me. So have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Sally. Thanks,
Good night.
Mary.
Good night.
Bilal.
Have a great meeting. Nice to meet everyone.